In the dense, steaming jungles of New Britain in early 1944, the air never stopped moving. It shimmered with heat and the hiss of unseen insects, thick enough to choke a man's breath. For the Americans newly arrived from the Solomon Islands campaign, this was the next stop in the island-hopping march toward Japan, another nameless stretch of green that bled men and metal. Among the rifles and carbines glinting under the canopy, a new shape stood out. The Browning Automatic Rifle, the BAR. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weapon wasn't new, but its role was. First fielded in 1918, the BAR was designed for trench warfare, a man-portable automatic rifle to walk forward with the infantry. It weighed nearly 20 pounds with a loaded magazine, awkward to carry, punishing on the shoulder. But in the Pacific, where every firefight was at 30 yards or less and the jungle swallowed the sound of gunfire, that weight became a small price for the punch it delivered. Records from the U.S. National Archives Ordnance Division show that Marine and Army units began modifying their BARs for the tropics. Bipods removed to save weight, slings adjusted for quick draw, ammunition pouches doubled on the belt. Jungle veterans learned to fire in 2 or 3 second bursts, just enough to keep the muzzle steady and the barrel cool. When they squeezed the trigger, the weapon spat a thunderous rhythmic bark that could stop an assault cold. The Japanese defenders learned to fear that sound. Captured documents from the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, describe enemy soldiers calling the BAR the Demon Rifle. It was heavier than the Arisaka rifles, slower than their Type 96 light machine gun, but its shock effect, that sudden burst of precise fire, was unlike anything they had faced before. On Bougainville, near the Torquay River line, squads of the 37th Infantry Division and the 3rd Marine Division were learning the same lessons at terrible cost. The enemy no longer met them in open battle. Instead, the Japanese built labyrinths into the hillsides, tunnels and caverns honeycombed with interlocking chambers, each manned by riflemen, machine gunners, and suicide grenadiers. These were not crude holes. They were engineered strongpoints, reinforced with coconut logs and sandbags, designed to absorb artillery and then unleash counterfire the moment an American showed his head. In this world of shadows, the BAR became the squad's lifeline. It wasn't a support weapon anymore. It was the centerpiece of every patrol. A Marine fire team moved around it like planets around a sun. Riflemen guarded its flanks, grenadiers cleared its path, and when contact came, the BAR roared first. One of those men was Sergeant William Bill Harper, a farm boy from Ohio who traded a plow for a rifle in 1942. His first combat came at Guadalcanal, where he saw how quickly the jungle erased distance and order. By 1944, Harper's hands knew the BAR like they knew their own heartbeat. The balance of it, the smell of burnt powder, the rhythm of its recoil. You didn't fire it, you held on and let it talk. He would later write in a brief note found in the 37th Division's unit log, the weapon wasn't new, but its role was. As the campaign on Bougainville dragged on, Harper's platoon was sent north to a ridge overlooking the Torquay River. Intelligence suggested a cluster of Japanese caves there, part of a defensive line still holding out months after the main force had been shattered. The men dug in for the night, mosquitoes whining around their helmets, the heavy scent of rot and cordite thick in the humid air. Somewhere in the darkness, faint hammering echoed, the enemy repairing his tunnels. Nobody slept much that night. The jungle was alive with unseen motion, whispers of movement between the trees. Harper sat awake, his BAR resting across his knees, finger brushing the worn metal of the trigger guard. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring another test, another lesson in how the Pacific turned ordinary weapons into instruments of survival. And before the month was out, that same weapon would carve its name into the memory of every man on that ridge, in a single blinding burst that ended a fight before it began. By March 1944, the American advance on Bougainville had slowed to a crawl. The jungle wasn't just thick, it was alive and armed. The Japanese 17th Army, commanded by Harakuchi Hayatake, had long since learned that open-field battles favored American artillery and air power. Their new strategy was to vanish underground. Caves, tunnels, and spider holes became an invisible fortress, one that breathed, fired, and bled without ever showing its face. Captured field orders and engineering sketches from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary later revealed the detail of their defenses. Firing slits angled downward to deflect bullets, hidden crawl spaces connecting chambers, and escape routes that opened into gullies where counterattacks could be launched. American grenades or flamethrowers could silence one entrance, but the defenders would reappear from another. To the infantrymen on the ground, it felt as though the island itself was shooting back. The U.S. after-action reports from 13th Fighter Command called it a war of holes. Every ridge was honeycombed, every hill a labyrinth. Even aerial bombing did little good. The bombs simply collapsed soil into new layers of concealment. The only way to clear these caves was to crawl right up to them. That was where men like Sergeant Bill Harper came in. His squad, 9 men of B Company, 148th Infantry Regiment, operated as part of a patrol assigned to clear a section of high ground near a river bend locals called Hill 305. The ridge overlooked a valley once used as a Japanese airstrip, now reclaimed by the jungle. The U.S. command suspected the enemy had fortified it to protect the remnants of their supply routes. Harper had no illusions about the task. He'd seen what happened to squads who got too close to a live cave. The Japanese preferred to wait, sometimes for hours, until a man's guard dropped, then open fire from 10 yards away. Even dead caves could be deadly. Booby traps and grenades on tripwires hung from the ceilings like jungle fruit. In interviews preserved in the 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion records, Harper's surviving comrade, Private Carl Jensen, described those days bluntly. You never knew if a hill was empty. You'd hear one voice, throw a grenade, hear 10 more. We started to believe the island was hollow. The BAR became the squad's spear point. Harper would advance just behind the scouts, crouched, finger hovering over the trigger. When firing broke out, his job wasn't to kill a few men. It was to drown out the enemy's will to fight. The .30-06 rounds from his automatic rifle could tear through bamboo, logs, and the thin earthen walls of most cave mouths. The trick was to hit hard before they could respond. Japanese records, specifically a post-war interrogation of Sergeant Arata Matsui, confirmed the weapon's reputation. When the enemy fired the long gun, we could not raise our heads. It made us think there were many of them. We called it the Thunderstick. On March 30th, Harper's platoon came across a cluster of 3 caves dug into the northern slope of Hill 305. A trickle of smoke rose from one, a telltale sign of cooking fires deep within. Lieutenant Harris, their platoon leader, ordered the men to hold position while he radioed for air support. But it was already late afternoon, and the Corsairs weren't flying this sector anymore. The ridge would have to be cleared by hand. As dusk fell, Harper moved his men into position, 2 riflemen on his right, Jensen with a bag of grenades on his left. They were 20 yards from the nearest opening, the jungle floor slick and dark under their boots. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone bird screeched and went silent. The cave ahead yawned black and still, but everyone knew it was alive. Harper steadied his BAR against a tree root. The forest smelled of earth, oil, and tension. He checked his first magazine. 19 rounds left after sighting fire earlier that morning. Enough, he thought grimly, for whatever came out of that hole. Night fell fast in Bougainville. In another hour, visibility would be gone. Harris signaled to pull back, but before the order reached Harper's position, a faint metallic clink echoed from inside the cave, like the pull of a pin. Jensen whispered, "They're coming." And in that instant, the quiet ridge became a battlefield of ghosts. The ridge above the Tirokanarula was barely more than a hump of clay and tangled vines. But for the men of B Company, it might as well have been a fortress wall. By nightfall on April 18, 1944, the jungle around Hill 305 was whispering with movement, too steady, too deliberate to be windy. Harper's squad, dug into the forward foxholes, could feel it. The Japanese weren't gone. They were waiting. In the 37th Infantry Division's daily log for that day, the entry was short and clinical.
B Company, 148th Infantry Regiment, reports enemy activity near Hill 305. Estimated platoon-sized element. Artillery unavailable. Hold position. That was the sum of their orders. Hold. Harper checked his BAR one more time. He'd removed the bipod days ago. It was dead weight in the mud. Across his lap, the weapon gleamed dull and black under the flicker of a red-lensed flashlight. 5 magazines sat within reach, each wrapped in a strip of burlap to keep them from clinking. His assistant gunner Jensen leaned close. "We got movement left," he whispered. Harper nodded. He could hear it too, the faint crunch of feet, then silence. In 0215, the first mortar shell fell short, splashing mud onto their helmets. The next landed close enough to rattle their teeth. Japanese troops were probing the line, using fire to mask an approach. The platoon sergeant hissed into the radio for artillery support, but the net was busy. Other units were already under attack. For now, they were alone. The jungle erupted in flickers of orange. Machine gun tracers stitched through the trees, and the night came alive with shouting in Japanese. From somewhere uphill, Harper caught the metallic glint of a helmet, then a second, then a dozen. A whole squad was spilling from the mouth of a cave halfway up the slope.
"Light 'em up," Jensen shouted. Harper braced the BAR against the edge of his foxhole, drew a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon roared to life, a deep, hammering rhythm that drowned out the shrieks and the crack of rifles. The first burst tore through the leading men like a scythe. He saw one tumble backward, another crumple mid-step, the rest scattering for cover that didn't exist. Within seconds, the entire hillside was flashing with return fire. Type 99 rifles and a light machine gun, their tracers cutting through the dark. Bullets smacked into the trees around Harper's hole, snapping branches like twigs. A shard of bark sliced across his cheek, but he didn't flinch. He swapped magazines with practiced motion, slammed the bolt forward, and let loose another burst. The BAR's 30-06 rounds slammed into the cave entrance, sparks flying as they struck rock and metal. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The weapon's slow, rhythmic fire echoing across the ridge like a drumbeat of steel. Jensen tossed 2 grenades toward the opening, the explosions thudding deep inside. Then, silence. The sudden quiet was worse than the noise. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Smoke hung low over the ground, drifting between the trees. Harper could hear his own barrel cooling. He kept the weapon trained on the cave mouth, finger hovering over the trigger. Minutes crawled by. Somewhere behind him, Lieutenant Harris whispered over the line. "Status?" Harper answered without turning his head. "They're still in there." At 0340, faint movement stirred at the cave again. Not a rush this time, but the slow drag of bodies. Harper saw one figure crawl into view, rifle clutched limply in one hand. Another followed, trying to pull him back inside. He didn't hesitate. One short burst, 4 rounds, ended it. The fight faded as quickly as it had begun. The Japanese attack melted into the jungle, leaving only the smell of cordite and the faint crackle of burning brush. Harper sat back, chest heaving, ears ringing from the noise. His hands trembled, but the BAR remained steady across his knees. When dawn came, the ridge was still theirs. The platoon had held, though 3 men lay wounded and 2 were missing. As sunlight filtered through the leaves, Harris came up the line to Harper's position. "Good work, Sergeant," he said quietly, glancing toward the cave. "We'll see what's left of them when it's light." Harper didn't answer. He just nodded, thumb brushing the warm metal of his rifle. The ridge had been held, but something told him the war inside that cave wasn't finished yet. Tomorrow, they will go in. Dawn came gray and heavy over Hill 305. The mist clung to the trees, curling around the foxholes like smoke from an unseen fire. The smell of damp soil and burned powder still lingered, the ghosts of the night's fight. Harper's squad hadn't slept. They'd spent the dark hours listening to the jungle breathe, waiting for another attack that never came.
At first light, Lieutenant Harris crawled over to Harper's position. "We're going to clear that cave," he said quietly. "Command wants confirmation. No survivors, no resupply tunnels." Harper just nodded. He'd been expecting the order. The ridge had to be secure before the battalion pushed north. According to the 37th Infantry Division's April 19 after-action report, the caves at Hill 305 were part of a larger defensive belt, interconnected through narrow earthen corridors. Patrols had found signs of recent excavation, boot prints, fresh smoke, spent cartridge cases. Somewhere inside, the remnants of a Japanese squad were waiting. Harper checked his BAR again. The receiver was clean, though the barrel still smelled faintly of burnt oil. He loaded a fresh magazine, 20 rounds of 30-06, each a finger of brass and promise. Around him, Jensen and the others prepared grenades, fixed bayonets, and adjusted their helmets. No one spoke. Words didn't belong in moments like this. They moved forward slowly, crouched low, rifles raised. The cave entrance gaped 10 yards ahead, half hidden behind a curtain of vines and tangled roots. It looked lifeless, but Harper had learned that nothing in the Pacific was ever truly still. When they were 10 paces away, a sudden noise broke the stillness. A cough, ragged and human. Then movement, a helmet glinting in the dim light, a shadow shifting just inside the mouth. "Contact!" Jensen hissed. Before the word finished leaving his lips, Harper had already raised the BAR and sighted down the line of his barrel. Through the mist, half a dozen shapes surged forward. Japanese infantry, some crouched, some sprinting, all screaming. The world compressed into a heartbeat of reflex. Harper squeezed the trigger. The BAR roared. 8 rounds spat in a single rolling burst, each one a hammer stroke. The recoil drove into his shoulder like a living thing, but his stance was solid. The first 3 bullets cut through the lead runner's chest. The next tore into the pair behind him. At that distance, barely 30 yards, the rounds had nowhere to go but through flesh and bone. Men collapsed mid-stride, rifles tumbling into the mud. Eyewitness accounts in the U.S. Army debriefing reports, April 20, 1944, later recorded,
The first burst dropped every man in the open. No second fire from the cave was observed for several minutes. Jensen threw 2 grenades into the mouth of the cave. The explosions rolled deep underground, followed by a wet echo of crumbling earth. Smoke poured from the entrance, thick and acrid. Harper stayed where he was, muzzle steady, eyes fixed on the opening. He could hear something. Faint scuffling, maybe whispers. Then silence again. When the air cleared, he rose to one knee. The scene before him was surreal, a tableau frozen in motion. Bodies lay sprawled across the slope, most fallen where they stood. The ground was torn by bullet strikes. Vines still twitched where rounds had cut through them. Harper's barrel smoked faintly, the metal hot to the touch. Jensen exhaled slowly. "One burst," he murmured. "Just one." Harper said nothing. He ejected the spent magazine, slid in a fresh one, and watched the cave mouth for movement. Nothing stirred. Even the birds had gone silent. Later, in the 13th Fighter Command debriefings, air reconnaissance confirmed no further resistance from Hill 305 for the rest of that week. It was as though the fight had ended in that single flash of fire. Back in camp, Harper's commanding officer would write a single line in his report. Cave neutralized by 1 BAR burst. Estimated enemy squad destroyed. But for Harper, the sound of that burst would echo far longer. He would remember the way the jungle had gone suddenly quiet, the way, for one instant, the war seemed to hold its breath. And deep in the earth beneath his boots, the silence of the cave felt less like victory and more like a warning.
For nearly 10 minutes after the smoke cleared, the ridge stood in absolute silence. The only sound was the faint pop and hiss of burning vines. Harper's men stayed low, rifles aimed at the mouth of the cave. They'd seen caves play dead before, let Americans approach, then erupt in fire the moment someone stepped inside. Harper knew better than to move. Wait. Just wait. At 06:17, according to the 148th Infantry Regiment's debriefing log, the silence broke. A sudden flicker, muzzle flash deep inside the cave. The next instant, a burst of 7.7mm rounds ripped through the trees, kicking dirt and splinters across the American line. A Japanese Type 99 light machine gun had come alive inside the darkness. "Down!" Harper shouted, slamming himself behind a root as rounds tore through the brush. The enemy gunner couldn't see them directly, but he was sweeping the slope blind, pouring bullets toward the sound of their voices. The air snapped with ricochets, and the bark above Harper's head exploded into shards. Jensen crawled beside him, face streaked with sweat and mud. "They're still in there. At least one gun, maybe two." Harper nodded. The BAR was already in his hands. He pushed the selector to full auto and braced the stock against the muddy ridge. He said, "Cover me." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He leaned out and fired 3 short bursts, controlled, deliberate. The .30-06 round slammed into the dark opening, sparks flashing where they struck stone. Each burst was followed by a heartbeat of silence. Then more return fire from inside. The echo turned the jungle into a drum of overlapping thunder. The BAR's deep roar cut through it all. Even under the enemy's machine gun fire, its rhythm was unmistakable, a steady, relentless hammering that made the Japanese hesitate. Harper knew that every time he fired, he had maybe 3 seconds before the enemy found his muzzle flash. He shifted positions after each burst, crawling 5 feet to the left or right, never letting them fix his spot. The tactic was textbook, straight from the Marine Corps Field Manual FM 31-35, Jungle Warfare. But in that suffocating heat, it felt like pure instinct. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the earthy tang of the jungle, and smoke drifted through the ferns. Then came the grenades. The Japanese started rolling them out of the cave mouth, each one tumbling down the slope with a dull metallic bounce. Harper and his men stayed low, rifles aimed at the mouth of the cave. "We gotta end this," Jensen yelled over the roar. Harper didn't answer. He had already pulled the pin from one of his own grenades, an M2 fragmentation, and waited. 3 seconds. Then he lobbed it high, straight into the cave mouth. The detonation was sharper, cleaner, echoing like a cannon shot inside the confined tunnel. The enemy gunfire stopped. He didn't wait. Harper rose to a crouch, sighted again, and poured another 10 rounds straight into the black. The BAR chugged, each round thudding home like a heartbeat. The air filled with dust and the faint metallic whine of ricochets. When the bolt locked open, he reached for another magazine, then stopped. The cave had gone still again. No muzzle flashes, no movement. Just the slow drift of smoke, curling out like a dying breath.
For a full minute, nobody moved. Then Lieutenant Harris's voice came over the line. "Hold your position. We'll send the engineers up." Harper lowered the BAR and sat back in the mud, sweat streaming down his face. His arms ached from the recoil. His ears rang from the confined thunder. Jensen crawled over and offered a canteen. "You think they're done?" he asked. Harper took a drink, eyes still fixed on the cave. "No," he said quietly. "They're never all done." Later, post-action interviews collected in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Pacific Theater would describe that fight as typical of the cave-clearing battles that defined the war's final island campaigns. The enemy didn't retreat, didn't surrender. They simply fought until silence. And on Hill 305, that silence had come at a terrible cost. By mid-morning, the engineers finally arrived. 2 men from battalion headquarters armed with satchel charges and flamethrowers, moving cautiously up the slope toward the blackened cave mouth. The fight on Hill 305 had ended hours earlier, but nobody in Harper's platoon trusted the quiet. Too many times they'd seen caves erupt back to life when someone assumed they were empty. "Keep that bar on 'em, Sergeant," Lieutenant Harris said, crouching beside Harper. "If anything moves, I want it gone before those engineers get close." "Yes, sir," Harper replied, eyes never leaving the dark hole in the hillside. The barrel of his BAR still smelled faintly of oil and cordite. A dozen empty magazines were scattered around his foxhole, the brass catching morning light like tarnished coins. The engineers paused 10 yards from the entrance, listening. Nothing. Just the slow drip of water from the trees and the hum of insects reclaiming the battlefield. One of them called back quietly, "Looks cold." "Check it," Harris ordered. The lead engineer stepped forward, flamethrower nozzle ready, and peered inside. The tunnel angled downward, the floor coated with mud and blood. A faint haze of smoke still drifted out, carrying the acrid stench of burned powder and flesh. He turned back and gave a small, sharp nod. "It's done." Harper stood, muscles stiff from hours in the dirt, and followed Harris and the engineers to the cave mouth. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with decay and carbon. The beam from Harris's flashlight cut through the gloom, and what it revealed turned every stomach on that ridge. 10 Japanese soldiers lay sprawled across the chamber floor, their bodies twisted and scorched. Some were still clutching rifles. One had his hand frozen around the grip of a Type 99 light machine gun. The first 3 men had died closest to the entrance, struck mid-charge by Harper's initial burst. Behind them, 2 more lay collapsed around the gunner's position, riddled with rounds that had punched straight through the bamboo firing screen. It was as the 37th Infantry Division's after-action report, April 19, 1944, later summarized, an entire enemy squad neutralized within seconds by concentrated automatic rifle fire. Jensen crouched beside the bodies, silent for a long time. "All from one burst. Jesus, Bill. You cut them down like grass." Harper didn't answer. He just looked at the cave wall behind the corpses. Each bullet strike left a bright mark in the packed clay, evenly spaced, proof of the weapon's steady control. The BAR had done what it was made to do. And yet, looking at the faces of the men inside, young, mud-streaked, their uniforms no different in color than his own, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Post-war Japanese interrogation reports, 1945-46, later translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, recorded local survivors' disbelief at the event. "The Americans fired so quickly, we believed they had several machine guns. Later we learned it was one weapon. None of our men in that cave survived the first burst." The engineers moved deeper into the tunnel, checking for connecting shafts or secondary chambers. There were none. The space was small, 10 meters deep at most, the walls blackened with soot from grenades and gunfire. When they finished, they planted 2 demolition charges at the rear, set the fuses, and backed out. Harper and his squad took cover as the explosions rolled through the ridge, collapsing the tunnel mouth and sealing the dead inside. The ground shuddered, and a plume of dust rose into the canopy, then drifted away. Afterward, the men sat in silence. The adrenaline had drained, leaving only fatigue. Lieutenant Harris filled out the engagement report in his small, mud-stained notebook. Under enemy casualties, he wrote, 10 confirmed KIA, 1 cave squad eliminated. Under friendly casualties, none. Harper set his BAR across his knees and stared into the settling haze. The ridge was quiet again, eerily so.
Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, but it felt far away, as if the war had moved on without them. Later, as they packed up to move out, Jensen looked back at the collapsed cave. "Think anyone will believe it?" he asked. Harper gave a tired half-smile. "Doesn't matter," he said. "The mountain knows."
In the official records, it was just another small victory, one of thousands written in the margins of the Pacific Campaign. But for the men who fought it, the memory of that single BAR burst, the sound, the shock, the silence that followed, would echo long after the war had ended. By mid-morning, the engineers finally arrived, 2 men from battalion headquarters armed with satchel charges and flamethrowers, moving cautiously up the slope toward the blackened cave mouth. The fight on Hill 305 had ended hours earlier, but nobody in Harper's platoon trusted the quiet. Too many times they'd seen caves erupt back to life when someone assumed they were empty. "Keep that BAR on 'em, Sergeant," Lieutenant Harris said, crouching beside Harper. "If anything moves, I want it gone before those engineers get close." "Yes, sir," Harper replied, eyes never leaving the dark hole in the hillside. The barrel of his BAR still smelled faintly of oil and cordite. A dozen empty magazines were scattered around his foxhole, the brass catching morning light like tarnished coins. The engineers paused 10 yards from the entrance, listening. Nothing, just the slow drip of water from the trees and the hum of insects reclaiming the battlefield. One of them called back quietly, "Looks cold." "Check it," Harris ordered. The lead engineer stepped forward, flame-throwing nozzle ready, and peered inside. The tunnel angled downward, the floor coated with mud and blood. A faint haze of smoke still drifted out, carrying the acrid stench of burned powder and flesh. He turned back and gave a small, sharp nod. "It's done." Harper stood, muscles stiff from hours in the dirt, and followed Harris and the engineers to the cave mouth. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with decay and carbon. The beam from Harris's flashlight cut through the gloom, and what it revealed turned every stomach on that ridge. 10 Japanese soldiers lay sprawled across the chamber floor, their bodies twisted and scorched. Some were still clutching rifles. One had his hand frozen around the grip of a Type 99 light machine gun. The first 3 men had died closest to the entrance, struck mid-charge by Harper's initial burst. Behind them, 2 more lay collapsed around the gunner's position, riddled by rounds that had punched straight through the bamboo firing screen. It was, as the 37th Infantry Division's after-action report, April 19, 1944, later summarized, an entire enemy squad neutralized within seconds by concentrated automatic rifle fire. Jensen crouched beside the bodies, silent for a long time. "All from one burst, Jesus, Bill. You cut them down like grass." Harper didn't answer. He just looked at the cave wall behind the corpses. Each bullet strike left a bright mark in the packed clay, evenly spaced, proof of the weapon's steady control. The BAR had done what it was made to do. And yet, looking at the faces of the men inside, young, mud-streaked, their uniforms no different in color than his own, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Post-war Japanese interrogation reports 1945-46, later translated by the Allied translator and interpreter section, recorded local survivors' disbelief at the event. "The Americans fired so quickly, we believed they had several machine guns. Later we learned it was one weapon. None of our men in that cave survived the first burst." The engineers moved deeper into the tunnel, checking for connecting shafts or secondary chambers. There were none. The space was small, 10 meters deep at most, the walls blackened with soot from grenades and gunfire. When they finished, they planted 2 demolition charges at the rear, set the fuses, and backed out. Harper and his squad took cover as the explosions rolled through the ridge, collapsing the tunnel mouth and sealing the dead inside. The ground shuddered, and a plume of dust rose into the canopy, then drifted away. Afterwards, the men sat in silence.
The adrenaline had drained, leaving only fatigue. Harper filled out the engagement report in his small, mud-stained notebook. Under enemy casualties, he wrote, 10 confirmed KIA, 1 cave squad eliminated. Under friendly casualties, none. Harper set his BAR across his knees and stared into the settling haze. The ridge was quiet again, eerily so. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, but it felt far away, as if the war had moved on without them. Later, as they packed up to move out, Jensen looked back at the collapsed cave. "Think anyone will believe it?" he asked. Harper gave a tired half-smile. "Doesn't matter," he said. "The mountain knows." In the official records, it was just another small victory, one of thousands written in the margins of the Pacific Campaign. But for the men who fought it, the memory of that single BAR burst, the sound, the shock, the silence that followed, would echo long after the war had ended. When the campaign ended, Harper's BAR was turned in like any other piece of government property, tagged, logged, and stored. It was just another rifle in the endless tide of weapons that had crossed the Pacific and back. But to the men of his platoon, that weapon had become
something more, a symbol of survival, of sudden and terrible power compressed into a few seconds of fire. Months later, aboard a troop ship bound for the United States, Jensen asked him about that day. "Have you ever thought about what happened in that cave?" Harper nodded slowly. "Every night," he said. "I pulled the trigger, but it wasn't about hate or anger. It was the only way to stop them before they stopped us." In post-war interviews recorded by the U.S. Army Historical Division, 1946, Harper's after-action testimony would echo that same thought. "You never forget the sound. One burst, then silence. That silence is louder than the gun." The Browning automatic rifle had been designed decades earlier, meant for open battlefields of Europe. Yet in the jungles and caves of the Pacific, it became a weapon of survival, precise, devastating, and utterly personal. Japanese officers later confirmed in ATIS Interrogation Report 1472 that small cave squads often assumed the Americans were firing with multiple light machine guns when struck by a single BAR burst. The concentrated fire from Harper's weapon had, as one captured officer admitted, the sound of many guns. For Harper, the weapon was no legend, just a burden carried, a memory sealed like the cave on Hill 305. And when he finally laid his rifle down, the war did not end in silence. It simply echoed on, one burst at a time. Years later, long after the Pacific had gone quiet and the uniforms were folded away, veterans like Sergeant William Harper still carried the memory of that hillside, the heat, the mud, and the sound of one BAR burst that stopped an entire cave squad. It was a story often whispered at reunions, sometimes doubted by those who hadn't seen the Pacific's brutal intimacy. But the records remained. 13th Fighter Command debriefs, 37th Infantry Division reports, and Japanese post-war testimonies, all telling the same improbable truth. Historians later called it a moment where man and machine met perfectly, a fusion of training, instinct, and design. The Browning automatic rifle, meant for Europe's trenches, had found its fiercest expression in the caves and ridges of the Pacific. A single gun in the hands of one steady soldier shaping the outcome of a battle far greater than himself. For Harper, it was never about legend. He returned home quietly, raised a family, and kept his medals tucked in a drawer. When asked by his grandson decades later if the story was true, if one burst really could stop an entire squad, Harper simply nodded. "It's not the burst you remember," he said softly. "It's what came after, the silence." In that silence rested the weight of the Pacific War. The courage, the cost, and the impossible moments where survival depended on seconds. The cave was long gone, overgrown by jungle and time, but the echo of that single burst remained, a reminder of how swiftly history can turn, and how one man, one weapon, and one moment could change everything.